They say time's a healer, but it never does heal. It's still a vivid memory. Helen was just a really, really happy-go-lucky girl. Absolutely music mad, dancing mad. We used to go to a lot of dancing, especially when I was in the army. I used to be so proud when I walked anywhere with her. I knew that other fellas was looking and thinking, cool, he's a lucky chap. And I was a lucky chap. I certainly wasn't keen on her going dancing, which obviously would have been with other men. But then her mum assured me that it was a regular thing when they were in Glasgow. And so I accepted what her mum had said and allowed her to go. But she didn't come home.
It's been Scotland's most enduring murder mystery.
3 women were killed after meeting a man at this Glasgow dance hall. He quoted the scriptures, leading to his nickname.
The notorious serial killer, Bible John.
We hadn't quoting all this Bible carry on. I think he was a bit of a fanatic, he had something against women.
I mean, this was somebody patrolling dance halls and picking up victims at random and killing them.
Hangs over Glasgow, the Bible John story. If we had an identity for this guy, if it's one guy, we could then parcel it up and put it away. It's the same with Jack the Ripper or certain American serial killings. They live long in the public memory for a reason, and that's because they feel that they're part of the fabric of the social and economic reality of that time. There is a dark force with a label on it, and the label is Bible John.
Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows my sorrow.
Well, when I came back to Glasgow in 1968, we were still living with the residue of bomb sites. The whole thing was absolutely shambolic.
It was a very dismal city. We had nothing. What we had was shared.
For the past 100 years or so, about half the population of Glasgow has lived in districts like these.
There is no bathroom, no hot water supply. On one side of the court, bubbling like some putrid mountain spring, there is a drain. What is it? What's going in there?
That toilet.
What's it like to live here? What do you think about it?
Awful.
Dear God, Scotland was very dreary, and Glasgow was. You can understand why people would go to the dance halls to get some kind of glitter in their lives.
Singing glory, hallelujah.
I was working in Rolls when I was 15, day shift. I would be home for about 5 o'clock, get my tea, and then I'd have my bath and start getting ready.
When you went to the dancing, you went spectacular. You were the bee's knees. We used to have a wee sort of a shampoo set on the Friday morning in work.
We didn't really go into pubs at that time. We used to go into one another's houses and sit, and you'd have a wee carry out, a wee drink, and then go to the dancing.
Back in the 60s, people didn't go home, have their tea, sit down, watch TV. The preeminent way of entertainment was largely going for a night at the dancing. And in fact, Glasgow was a city that was known to be dancing daft.
Everybody wanted to go dancing.
Hey baby, won't you take a chance?
The ballrooms were magnificent. These beautiful floors, which actually were sprung so that when you danced, you got a little feedback from the floor. It was magnificent.
You just used to make you feel good. Because you were going up to dance and have a laugh. That was it, just a laugh and looking pretty.
It was so innocent and nice.
Hey baby, if you're all alone,
All of that kind of changed after Bible John. He frightened a city.
When we arrived here, the body hadn't been moved. It was in a lane. So we were told at that time by the bosses, go and have a look and see. I was a CID man, and I've been to many murders where the body's still there. And most of them I can recall quite vividly. You don't forget these things. They're always with you. Even when you've left the police, as I have a long, long time ago, you don't forget these things. You saw the body, it's stuck in your mind, here's a young girl that's been killed. So right away what it does do is, it gives you fire in your belly. You're going to help solve this. You want to catch the guy that's did this.
At a murder, when there's a body found, if it's not cleared up within a maximum, I'd say, 48 hours, you're really struggling. People forget things, the locus where the crime happened changes, so you've got to get off your mark quickly.
Our job was to go to houses, and ask people if they'd heard anything, seen anything, etc.
The first thing you want to know is where she was staying, what sort of life she was leading, who her friends and possibly her enemies were.
The only thing that came from that was there was a lady heard a scream at a certain time, and it would be just around about midnight, and she heard a scream. But that was the only thing that came from it.
It all takes time, plus the fact that you've got newspaper reporters wanting stories, wanting to know what the latest is.
I think the Evening Citizen did 4 editions in a day. The first was on the streets at 11 o'clock in the morning. And that's where I came in quite often because I was the early shift reporter in first. Got the cream of the stories because I was in first.
Yes, calling Victor 1, would you attend in the Harbour Street?
We had a speaker on the news desk, which was manned by a funny little fella who was known as the Duke. Why, I don't know. He used to listen into the police blower, and he knew all the codes the police used. So he would say, oh, we've got a murder, and that's it. The reporter's off.
In the mornings, you went out in one of the radio cars, and you were in constant radio touch with the office. And you went from incident to robberies, to fires, to murders, you name it.
You dug around, spoke to as many people as possible. Then you had to phone the office.
And at that time, see when a murder happened, they used to put out a special paper. You know, the paperman would come in the street and he would shout special.
The naked body of a young woman was found today in a lane in residential Langside, Glasgow.
Special editions, if you had the lead story, there was a very good chance of getting a byline on it. A lot of it was instinct, gut feeling.
Detectives from Southern Division and the Flying Squad made door-to-door inquiries on the block bounded by Carmichael Lane.
You would know this story's going to run, this story's going to catch the eye.
Pat Docker was a nurse. Her body was found in a lane. She was naked.
These things stick in your mind. That was my era, and I remember that. I remember reading it in the papers.
The headline, Murder Techs Wait for Whisper. A whisper could give detectives the lead they need in their hunt for the killer of nurse, Mrs. Patricia Docker. I started my academic career as a historian, and one of the things that caught my imagination when I was doing my PhD was how important newspapers were and how murder is presented for public consumption, because that's how ordinary people actually understand it. And that's how I came across the Bible John murders. Mrs. Patricia Docker, her naked body is found. It's this emphasis on her nudity. Nobody's telling you she was a good woman, she was a popular woman, she was well liked, she was good at her job. Once again, the naked body, the naked woman. And she deserves more than that.
Hunt goes on for nurses' clothing. The hunt went on today for clothing belonging to murder victim Mrs. Patricia Docker, found naked in a lane in Langside, Glasgow 11 days ago, just a few hundred yards from where her 4-year-old son was sleeping. The whereabouts of her orange mini dress, teddy bear fur duffel coat and underwear have remained a mystery in spite of intensive police inquiries.
We went and we were hitting all the different houses round about and speaking to different people. That information gets fed back to the incident room, and the incident room and decides, which way you're going from there.
I would say 85–90% of murders are committed by some relation or friend. If the perpetrator of the crime is not connected in any way with the person he's just murdered, it's very difficult.
Once the body was removed, it goes away. Pathologists will tell you what the cause of death is. It came back that the cause of death was strangulation.
It transpired the girl was married and her husband was in the RAF.
Well, the police were able to rule the husband out very quickly, I believe in the first 48 hours. There was no way from the time when he was officially recorded as being seen and the time when his wife was killed, the logistics was simply not there. It turns the attention back onto Glasgow, onto somebody within the local community as being the likely murderer.
There were really no clues that might have suggested who it might have been. Pat Docker did work in Mearnskirk Hospital as a nurse and had a very respectable background. She was regularly a attender at the Majestic Dance Hall, but apparently on the way there she changed her mind and that night decided to go to Barrowland.
Patricia Docker's appearance at the Barrowland went almost completely unrecorded. These are the days before CCTV. You know, you paid your ticket at the door and disappeared into the crowd. The Barrowland was this huge dance hall with a reputation for great bands, brilliant dancers, jivers, you know, and a working class mecca where people who'd worked hard all week and had their pay packet on a Friday night went to the Barrowland and spent it.
In the Barrowland, down the stair was what you called the jive corner. There was, and I used to love watching them, and it was smashing.
Somebody would bring in a wee bottle of vodka, a half bottle of vodka in the handbag, sit up and just catch up with the week.
The lassies all stood in a kind of a crowd. You know, you stood in a crowd and the guy would just come up and say, you want to dance? You know, you either said aye or no. You know, and that was it.
Girls, you know, they were impressed if you could dance the waltz or the quick step or the paso doble.
You know, I wasn't the greatest a dancer, but I could dance a wee bit.
It would get towards the end of the evening and the last dance, the MC would say, right, boys and girls, it's lumber time. Which meant, you know, this is the time to make your play, lads.
If you were lucky enough to meet somebody, you'd a date for the next night, you know, if you were lucky.
Very often it was completely innocent, but of course other people men went, took off their wedding rings in the toilet and set out to catch a bit of skirt for the evening.
Initially, Patricia Docker told her mum and dad, who she was staying with, that she was going to the Majestic, which was a kind of upper class clientele. But it was then found that she'd probably done that because she didn't want to say to her parents that she was going to the Barrowland.
Pat Docker had a 4-year-old son. She was back living with her parents. Going out socialising the way she was going out socialising was a problem. And the event on at the Barrowland that particular day was an over 25s event.
A Thursday night was the night you would go slightly clandestinely to the Barrowland. So over 25s night, where people would go, many of whom were married. So they were there but not there. There was a kind of cloak of invisibility on a Thursday night at the Barrowland. The men especially often didn't use their own names. They would dance with these women. They would be married, the men. Some of the women would be married. They didn't want to be identified. So there was a lot of Johns in the Barrowland on a Thursday night in the 1960s.
The Barrowland Ballroom had a reputation. It's telling that her parents did not know she'd gone there.
The journey between dancehall and the site of her murder is almost completely empty of detail. Investigating officers at the time were taken aback by how few people were able to identify her movements that night.
It seems that Pat Docker just met this person in the dance hall that night and decided to go home or to go out away from Barrowland. A one-off meeting that turned bad.
The poor girl was naked, no handbag, and it was a sanitary pad lying beside her. So I think at that time the thoughts were it was just a guy who'd not had his evil way and had, just gone over the top and killed her. You know what I mean? These things did happen.
The murder of Pat Docker is one of those murders that's reported minimally because there isn't really seen as anything respectable in the way of the sensationalism to report. She had been beaten up, but domestic violence, any kind of violence, was far from uncommon in late 1960s Glasgow. So that in itself is not shocking, startling. It's almost expected. So the newspapers have no interest in pushing it, and the police have got quite enough on their hands to keep them occupied with other things.
Both the Glasgow Herald and the Scotsman lead on reactions to a report prepared for the Department of the Environment, which names Glasgow and Clydeside as the most deprived area in Britain. The Herald's headline asks if Glasgow is it still no mean city.
That area, that little triangle of the east end of Glasgow, the area around Barrowland Dance Hall was notorious as a place of theft, criminality, drunkenness. There's a sense of violence just simmering there.
This scuffle outside a dance hall wouldn't rate a local headline. Even a stabbing might not get more than a few lines down column in the Glasgow papers, because in this city of violence, ordinary stabbing is hardly news anymore.
Glasgow at that time had a level of violence second only to Chicago and New York.
On Saturday and Sunday nights, the casualty departments, it said, looked like slaughterhouses.
That image of No Mean City, the title of a famous slasher novel about the gangs of Glasgow and about the glamour of violence and the flashing of flick knives and so on, that stuck in Glasgow right into the period of the late 60s. Glasgow was still trying to deal with this bad image of itself as a violent city full of poverty and drink.
It's easier to buy a drink in the middle of Glasgow than in any other city in Britain. There are more than 1,000 pubs here, and most of them are concentrated around the centre of the city, where you only have to walk a few yards from one bar to the next.
I think that desperate poverty, the very poor housing conditions, the mass unemployment, made drink a kind of escape for people.
The pubs have closed, and for a hard-pressed, undermanned police force, Glasgow's normal Saturday night begins.
Most of the members of the police force at that time were big Highlanders. We used to say they came down to Glasgow to get boots on their feet. And of course the Neds, as we called them, they didn't have much regard for the police, to be honest with you.
You did see running street fights. See when the Orange Walk was on, that was bad. There was some bloody battles, right enough, definitely was, right?
We also had, of course, the genuine terrorism of the street gangs.
He's officially described as simply attacked in Dumbarton Road. In fact, he's been badly stabbed in the right shoulder.
Many of my colleagues, including myself, were hurt in the course of your duties because you were dealing with gangs, but you had to go to hospital because you had a few injuries. So it was as bad as that.
With the Glasgow force seriously undermanned, there are times when only 2 uniformed policemen control an area with a population the size of Perth.
There was not a huge amount of trust between the local communities in the poorer working class areas of Glasgow and the official police. And if the culture of the community engenders silence, then you're stuck. And the police undoubtedly were stuck.
Detective Superintendent Elphinston Dalgleish said,
"It is up to the public to help us find this killer. They must come forward and tell all they know that might be of relevance."
I personally, if I was in charge of a murder inquiry, wanted to solve it. But the problem is there's no clues, there's no fingerprints, no witnesses.
All we want is for people to tell us what they know. There may have been people at that dance who shouldn't have been there, yet they may have seen something. You can't shock a policeman. This is much more serious than the right or wrongs of being at a dance.
People didn't want to be questioned, didn't want to be identified. They were frightened that their own wives and families would find out that they'd been consorting with other women and having drinks in a dance hall, you know, when they should have been somewhere else. So in a sense, it was a great field of opportunity for an opportunistic killer.
For somebody like Pat Docker, enjoying herself in a way that was not seen as seemly or proper, and what happened to her, it would have been seen at the time as being partially her fault.
Eventually they found her handbag in the cart, and I think a wee bit of a watch or something like that. That was all they had. And that case just, they ploughed on, but it just disappeared again into the mists of time without a suspect or anything.
The plug got pulled on that one because there was other murders in Govan. They had 3 murders going at that time. You know, 2 were a couple, you know, an elderly couple. And there was a lady found down a railway embankment. She'd been raped and strangled. So there were murders all the time in Glasgow at the time. It sounds terrible, it sounds like Wild West, but it's true.
I couldn't tell you now, sadly, even guess how many murders I've covered. I couldn't begin to tell you. I've been covering them since I was 20 till I was 58. As you age, your aspect in life changes. I mean, when I was 20, a murder, oh boy, you're out the door, pen in hand, running, where am I going, what am I doing? Nowadays you think, oh God, no again, what's happened here? Murder it's vile. I mean, it's the end of a life, and there's always a sadness for a victim.
I was 4 years old when this happened, and as such, mercifully I have no memory at all of the events leading up to or directly after the tragedy. I can't remember the grief I must have gone through. I admit I find it difficult to think about it, even though disconnected in time and relationship. But there is no one left alive that I know of who knew her. Indeed, I would have liked to have known more about her myself. My father passed 3 years ago, and he was the last person I know of who knew her. She was an only child, and her parents died not long after she did. I can only imagine that the tragedy hastened that. It is very sad indeed that all the history and memories of a person disappear so. All I was told was that she was an excellent mother to me for the brief time we shared. Is no one safe? Murder is the ultimate in crime, and Glasgow's recent figures can give comfort to none. Police still seek the killer of 25-year-old Patricia Docker, and Glasgow magistrates report a shocking rise in crimes of violence in Glasgow, out of all proportion to its population.
The Daily Record's interest in crime was such that every night a reporter was assigned to go out in an office car and go around the police stations and report on minor crimes and go to the scenes of crimes. And the byline was Pat Roller, which was patroller. But in Glasgow, not all the people put that together. And he would get out of the car at a scene of some kind of crime, and the kids would come up and say, "Is that you, Pat? Is that you?" Pat Roller was a famous individual in Glasgow, but there were about half a dozen Pat Rollers, each one assigned on different nights to go out.
The newspapers run on ink and drink. It just seemed to be par for the course, going to the pub and talk to somebody, or going to the pub and talk to each other, or the number of people that will talk to you in a pub won't talk to you elsewhere.
A really successful crime reporter, and there were many in Glasgow. You couldn't do that job without being well known to all the cops.
Some of the guys got to know senior detectives well enough to go out and play golf for them.
I was very fortunate. I had a very, very, I could say, happy relationship with the police. I totally trusted them, and in life they trusted me.
The detectives of the time, they were household names themselves because they figured in the paper reports.
One of the things that you really have to do is to get in touch with the criminal element. They obviously are the ones that know what's been going on.
You need to know the shit from the pure. You got to know if it's going to get in the paper, and you must get the facts.
It was almost kind of like a criminal soap opera with three people in the casts: the reporters, the detectives, and the bad guys.
Glasgow's reputation for mindless violence doesn't match the violence of such inhuman living conditions.
As far as I was concerned, the poverty in Glasgow was much greater, and the condition of the city was an absolute mess.
Street after street of tenements like these, most of them without bathrooms or separate lavatories. Families of half a dozen and more packed into a single room. Just not good enough by the standards of our day.
When I worked for the Evening Citizen, I did a whole series of stories about the conditions that people were living in. And you would not have believed that on one occasion I went to a house, and a woman opened the door and said, "Come in and see this." And she had no windows in the house. The window frames had rotted so much the windows had fallen out. She was a single mother. Her and her little son stayed in that house. That's how they lived. It must have been perishing in the Glasgow winter.
A middle-class family will not tolerate these conditions for even as long as a weekend, and rightly so.
There's a crack up in the ceiling, and the kitchen sink is leaking. Out of work and got no money, a Sunday joint of bread and honey.
The tenements weren't badly built, but their cramped conditions made them slums of necessity.
You walked in this wee entrance, and we stayed in that side, the left side, and another family stayed in the right, and it was like a death trap. I mean, you went in, there was a set-in bed, that was my mum and stepdad's bed, and then there was a couch, and you pulled that down. I slept with my young brother's sister, and then in the morning, that's the tea went back up, and it was just like a couch. And the lassie above me, her mother had 10-year family, and it was nearly all daughters. And we used to all sit on the stairs, and my God, the place was minging.
Money was very tight, and there was no such thing as social security as what there is nowadays.
What are we living for?
The 1960s have no meaning here. In these streets, you're back in the 30s. It seems to have passed it by.
I thought Liverpool was bad, but I've never seen anything like this. It's the worst place I've been in, you know.
As a reporter, I get absolutely incensed at these conditions, and I suppose how people lived had something to do with the city's great love of dancing.
The dancing was our life. It was just our way of getting out of the doom and gloom.
My Auntie Mima was a lovely woman. She and my mum would go to the dancing near enough every weekend to get out and meet up with friends. They just loved the atmosphere. One night, my mum and my dad were arguing. My dad was saying he didn't want her to go to the Barrowland, and so for the first time she never went to the dancing with Auntie Mima. That was the night that my auntie was murdered.
Detectives were last night hunting the killer of a woman who took a midnight stroll to murder. From the bright Saturday night lights in one of Scotland's biggest dance halls, mother of three Mima MacDonald left to walk home.
Jemima was found in Bridgeton, Glasgow, which is a particularly run-down part of the east end of the city.
More than 30 hours later, her partly clothed body was found in a derelict tenement just 20 yards from her own home. She had been beaten and strangled.
Her body was found in a back court, and it was just utter degradation with rubbish and rubble and all the rest of it.
All day on Sunday, children in McKeith Street, Bridgeton played, running in and out of the house where the body was found.
And the rumour was going round that kids had spotted this body. It was disregarded for a while, and then the rumour grew and grew and grew. Mima's sister lived nearby, and she got to hear of the rumours, and she was really worried because her sister hadn't returned home. And she went to the scene, and lo and behold, she found her. It must have been horrific for her, and she found her sister lying there.
It was a picture of what life was like in the Glasgow of that era. The area had been written off, if not the inhabitants, and it was very sad that children should have stumbled on a scene like this.
This is something where the police get called in after the community has found Jemima.
Obviously, the first thing that you want to do is preserve the locus. That's got to be done. But if you've got a body in a back court, you've got a different scenario entirely.
They'd actually moved the body, contaminated the scene, because they wanted to try to help. What can we do? Is she dead? And to her sister, how tragic and appalling for her.
I was only 10 years old when life was turned upside down. It's haunted me my whole life, with all the bad things that have happened from that day. My mum started to drink heavy, which was all new to the family, but that's how it went on for years. She blamed herself and said it should be her that's dead, not Mima. We went to visit her in hospital, and I knew then how sick my mum had become. I feel so angry and cheated out of life because of one man. I've been so afraid for 50 years, always looking behind me.
Jemima MacDonald found murdered in a broken down tenement in Brigton, by children playing a few doors down from the quite broken down property that she lived in. These were working class people living in difficult circumstances, out for one night of fun, ending up dead, part of the broken down system that they were living at the centre of.
City Murder Squad quiz dancers. Detectives hunting the killer of 32-year-old Glasgow mother of three Jemima MacDonald were today interviewing dancers who had been at the Barrowland Ballroom at the weekend and who may have been the last people to see her alive.
Police also during the time concentrated a lot of the time in undercover work in the ballroom itself.
I went along and we tried to mix with the dancers and the people there.
And we would dance with different ladies and speak to them to see if any of them had any bad experiences and try and get information that way.
You can spot them a mile away, plainclothes police. But outside the Barrowland, you would see some, actual police. But inside the Ark, you can spot them a mile away, so you know who they are.
I wasn't a dancer, and someone asked me if I'd dance, and I said, well, I'm not a dancer. I'll get up and just shake your bum about. So I got up and took 2 steps. I was getting really proud of myself. She said, you're rubbish right enough, you carry down, and dumped me in the middle of the floor and away.
The police were all over the place. They must have interviewed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds.
An important witness has come forward and gave us very useful information. There seems to be fairly reliable evidence that she met up with a young man and that they had drinks together before going off to the Barrowland for the evening.
Certainly she'd been at the Barrowland 2 or 3 times in that week, so she was next door and a kind of regular. So maybe had the killer spotted her before and picked her out as a potential victim.
Her clothes were torn and she'd been beaten. She'd been strangled with her own stockings. And she'd been raped.
Murders may be linked. There are certain similarities between the murders of Miss Mima MacDonald and Mrs. Patricia Docker, the auxiliary nurse who was murdered in Glasgow last year.
After the second murder, in my own mind, it was the work of the same guy. I've got to say, the circumstances were all quite similar.
They'd been to the Barrowland Ballroom, both of them. They'd both of them been sexually assaulted. The crime scene was contaminated by the time that the police arrived. The thing that was missing was her handbag.
To me, it was more than coincidence that there were 2 killers, sadistic killers of women knocking about. And I thought, really, at the time, it was the same man that had committed the 2. I think the police privately would say that, but publicly would deny it, as they did.
By the time we moved on to two murders, and the police verified the link, or the possible link, it was beginning to get to a point where people were thinking about it seriously and worried about it.
Oh, it would upset people right enough, and it was making you scared. We were just hoping that he was going to get caught.
This is where the first publication of The Possible Suspect is found. Find this man.
Find this man is Murder Squad plea. Police want to interview this man in their bid to find the killer of Mrs. Mima MacDonald.
The previous Saturday evening, Mima was seen leaving Barrowland Ballroom with a tall, well-dressed man.
For the first time in Scotland, they asked newspapers to publish an artist's impression. The drawing has been put together by a witness who twice saw the man with Miss MacDonald.
Mr. Dalglish, this is the first time an artist's impression has been used in Scotland.
I understand that.
And why was it necessary in this case?
Well, we feel that it gives a sort of realism and raises the photograph from mere words into something resembling a living person.
He looked as if he blended in with everybody, because all the lads wore suits and ties and lovely shiny shoes and had short back hair. Not like today, scruffies.
Any person who sees this artist's impression in the press or on television and who feels that they can usefully assist the police in identifying this man is urged to come forward forthwith with any information that they may have.
People just got on with life. The police were looking for him, so therefore you didn't take any notice of it.
You just as well, it will never happen to me, hope it never happens to me. Just things like that. You just had to get on with it. Aye.
Police information room.
141 Police Constable Marine Division. I have a report of a body found in Earl Street, Scotstoun.
Fine, we'll get you assistance here as soon as we can.
Thank you.
The situation changed dramatically when there was a third murder. That's really when it all blew up. You know, everything, went into overdrive.
Tango 5, would you attend at Earl Street in Scotstoun? A report of a body found.
Tango 5 will attend. Out.
In a city that was quite famous for homicides, these were sinister and were linked by this man who seemed to be on the rampage.
When you get someone out of the blue murdering, possibly for pleasure, if you like, it's very difficult when you get something like that.
We have the body of a woman here. Possible murder. Could you have the CID attend immediately? Tango 5 over.
Roger, Tango 5.
I met Helen in 1962 and I was completely smitten by her straight away. I mean, I didn't think I had any chance when I first saw her, but we got married in Reading. My mum and dad were really, really pleased, and found what a nice girl she was, and that I was very lucky to have found her. We used to go to a lot of dancing, especially when I was in the army. They used to actually have dances there. It was just a happy time. Just being with the two boys that we had, was great fun. I was in the army and Helen had gone to her mother's in Glasgow with my two boys because I'd been moved from Germany, and after a week I went up to Glasgow, and that's where things suddenly went terribly wrong. I certainly wasn't keen on her going dancing, which obviously would have been with other men, but was assured by her mum that this was something they really enjoyed doing. There was nothing in it, nothing to worry about. And so I accepted what her mum had said, and allowed her to go. At that time, Glasgow wasn't really that nice a place to be. There was a lot of thuggery and goodness knows what up there. So when Helen was going out with her sister Jeannie, I thought, well, I don't want to risk them coming home on the bus, because even on the buses there was always trouble. So I actually gave her a £5 note to come home by taxi, and it's the worst £5 I've ever spent. It's just a feeling you can't describe, never describe it. The hurt, the heartache for me and my family.
Third time round, I do remember the murder of Helen. I was out very early in the morning and went to a lane behind some tenements in Scotland, I think it was, yeah. And I couldn't believe my eyes. None of the reporters who were there could believe what they were looking at, because there must have been 100 policemen packed into that little lane, listening to the boss doling out jobs and whatnot. By that time, I can only imagine that the police were in a blind panic, because they had had 3, and from what we know since, they were almost identical murders.
In the morning when I woke up, she still wasn't home, and I went into the front bedroom and looked out of the window, and I saw a police van. Don't ask me why, but I knew then that something was wrong. And so I went down, and as I'm walking towards the police caravan, I heard people saying, "Oh, there's a girl and she's been murdered." And I got to the caravan and spoke to a policeman, and he obviously went out the back to where Helen was lying, and the chief police officer, Inspector Beattie, came out and said to me, "What was your wife wearing, son?" And I said, "A fur ocelot coat, a black dress." And it was then he told me, "I'm sorry, but she has been murdered." And that was the first I knew.
A black Labrador dog being taken for an early morning walk by his owner found the body of Helen Puttock in this back court at 95 Earl Street. She had been beaten and strangled. She was lying face downwards at an angle to a wall, her clothes badly displaced. There were signs that at one stage she might have tried to escape from her attacker, run up that embankment and been dragged back.
It was only really after the third murder that everybody did realise there's a serial killer that's on the loose. We'd never experienced anything like that, you know, mass murderers, except for Peter Manuel, which was a completely different sort of murder. He was a housebreaker who, you know, shot his victims as they slept and all the rest of it. But, I mean, this was somebody patrolling dance halls and picking up victims at random and killing them, and it became a major, major story.
Mother of two and attractive brunette Mrs. Helen Puttock was found dead today in a grass-covered backcourt.
We cannot rule out a link between this death and that of Jemima MacDonald at Bridgeton 3 months ago,
said Detective Chief Super Elphinston Dalgleish.
People were, by that time, beginning to get quite upset about it all. And women became terrified of leaving a dance hall with a man.
I wouldn't go myself to meet my pals any dancing. We met up and we came home together, shared a taxi.
So to a certain extent, there was a loss of innocence, and this man, Bible John, played a big part in it.
It was the third of the killings, the killing of Helen Puttock from Scotstoun, that really brought, if you like, this invisible man really into focus.
The big thing was, third one, there was a witness.
Glasgow at that time was in a state of flux.
People were living in awful conditions.
People still hadn't recovered from the war.
So there was a kind of evangelism about ridding the city of its famous slums.
It wasn't just change, it was change that could not be understood.
It was real physical alteration in the fabric of the city.
There was no thought about community. They just chipped the people out and left them get on with it.
The old way of working class life was being swept away overnight.
Emptiness, an absolute dislocation.
Everything Glasgow knew was being taken away, and that was stitched into further anxiety about this man who seemed to be on the rampage.
It's been Scotland's most enduring murder mystery.
3 women were killed after meeting a man at this Glasgow dance hall. He quoted the scriptures, leading to his nickname.
The notorious serial killer Bible John.
There was something about these particular killings that got under the skin.
I mean, this was somebody patrolling dance halls and picking up victims at random and killing them.
The notion of this kind of sadistic sexual murderer just really wasn't around at that point in our history.
It was the biggest murder investigation of its kind in Scotland.
The investigators were suddenly trying to work out how it is that 3 times this man was able to kill and slip away.
They say time's a healer, but it never does heal. It's still a vivid memory.
It was the third of the Bible John killings that really brought this invisible man and this myth really into focus.
The big thing was, third one, there was a witness.
When I began investigating the Bible John murders, I was commissioned by the Sunday Times to go and track down some of the people who had been centrally involved in the case. And a critical witness was Jeannie Williams, who was Helen Puttock's sister. Jeannie was a very impressive witness. She remembered that they decided to go out dancing, and Helen was married, and her husband, who was in the army, was on leave at home at the time.
Yeah, I just was at home with the boys and obviously put them to bed, and her mum said to me, you know, for goodness sake, don't worry, it's natural and just something she likes to do. And so in the end, I actually fell asleep.
They headed off to the Barrowland, and the place was, as usual, heaving. There were dancers on the floor, there were others round the edges, sort of eyeing up the talent, as it were. And I think it was Jeannie who first picked up a dancing partner who was a very good dancer called John. And then Jeannie noticed a man who was, she said, a cut above the others. He seemed well turned out, short haircut, very smartly dressed in a brown suit. He came along and asked Helen to dance. They spent the evening dancing, and then they all four left together. And as they were leaving, there was a problem with the cigarette machine. They put the money in and the cigarettes wouldn't come out. This character, John, suddenly got absolutely enraged by this, and she noticed his cold anger. He turned to them and said, "These places are dens of iniquity." Jeannie took in all the detail of his appearance. One thing she noted was that his two front teeth were crossed and he had a missing tooth at the back. Now, that was obviously a very important detail.
The night was cold and dry, and the news vendors with the first editions of the morning papers were on the verge of quitting the corners as the streets emptied.
They walked out, they caught a taxi. The other John went off and caught a bus, leaving the three of them together. That's Jeannie, Helen, and this man, John. They shared the taxi because in those days, taxis were expensive. They talked a bit about him and his life, although he was, she remembers, rather withdrawn. And then at one stage, she asked, "Do you support Celtic or Rangers?" And he said he was agnostic. And Jeannie didn't know what agnostic meant. And she said, "Does that mean you're an atheist?" And he then quoted something from the Bible. Now, she couldn't remember what the exact quotation was. And then he insisted that Jeannie get out of the taxi near her home. And that was the last that Jeannie ever saw of her sister, Helen.
At 7:25 the next morning, a black Labrador dog being taken for an early morning walk by his owner found the body of Helen Puttock in this back court at 95 Errol Street. She had been beaten and strangled. She was lying face downwards at an angle to a wall, her clothes badly displaced. There were signs that at one stage she might have tried to escape from her attacker, run up that embankment, and been dragged back. The murder hunt began. Police combed the back court and the railway embankment. They traced the taxi and the driver. In charge of the police inquiries in this case, a man who handled 9 successful murder investigations last year alone, former RAF pilot, now Detective Superintendent, Joseph Beattie.
Will you see to that before tomorrow?
Joe Beattie was the absolutely classic Glasgow detective. meticulous in his search for detail.
The following day, Joe Beattie took me into the bedroom, and the first question he asked me was, "Did you hit her?" And I said no. And he then stripped me and completely went over my body to make sure I had no scratch marks or anything like that on my body. And then he said, "I'm ever so sorry, son. I didn't think for 1 minute it was you, but it's something I had to do."
In these days, I'm still just a very young detective, but even the worst detective could put it together that these three could be linked. They might not have been, but you've got to look at it. That's really when it all blew up. You know, everything, into overdrive.
Police believe there are similarities in the killing of Mrs. Puttock and the deaths of 2 other women in the past year. Nurse Patricia Docker was discovered dead in Langside a year ago, and mother of 3, Miss Jemima MacDonald, was found dead in Bridgeton 3 months ago.
They were so similar.
On each occasion, they had all been at the Barrowland.
The 3 of them murdered by strangulation.
On each occasion, an article of clothing was removed.
The 3 of them raped.
On each occasion, the women were menstruating.
3 in a oneer, a serial killer on the loose just shocked people.
There was immediate speculation that he was some kind of sexual deviant, some speculation that he'd had an issue with women who were menstruating and had turned against women for that reason.
There was nothing different about them, they were just women. 4 unfortunate lambs who were led to the slaughter by this guy.
This was the condition in which the body was found. Helen had been knocked unconscious and strangled with one of her stockings. Her face was bruised, and from the grass and broken dock leaves stuck to her feet and her neck, it was clear she'd put up a fierce struggle. There were signs she'd tried to escape from her killer by scrambling up the railway embankment that ran along the back of the gardens behind the close. She'd been caught, struck with some heavy instrument on the head, and dragged back along the grass before she'd succumbed.
The evidence is perfectly plain. Helen Puttock is on her way home to her husband and children and is raped and killed. She fought. Her body gives clear evidence that there was a considerable, brutal and painful struggle.
I know how strong she was. I know what a fighter she was. I knew straight away, from what Joe Beattie told me, that it was a maniac. But then it was very, very difficult to know exactly what to do, because the 2 boys, they were very young at the time. Helen was absolutely devoted to them, and they loved her to bits. David was 5 and Michael was 18 months old. So obviously at that age there was no way I could tell them that their mum's been strangled. And so I actually told them, well, I told David, because Michael was too young to understand anyway, that his mum had been hit by a bus and she had been killed. But that was just a white lie, because I just couldn't bring myself to tell them the actual truth at that time. Well, what happened was, when Michael was 7, on his way home from school, one of his friends from down the road, she suddenly said to Michael, "Do you know your mum was murdered?" And that's how he found out. He was really anti-me because I had actually told them a lie that, you know, she had been run down by a bus. And in fact, at one stage, he even more or less accused me of doing it, which was very hurtful to me. Because Michael thought that I'd lied to him and that maybe I was involved, we'd more or less become estranged for about 20 years. And so it was just sad when I was told that he had died. All through his life, he actually felt that society owed him a debt because of what it had done to his mum.
Now, the police would like to talk to this man because they feel he could give them vital assistance in their inquiries. But he may have reasons of his own for not coming forward, but the police will exercise the maximum discretion and if he will only talk to them.
Joe Beattie was in tremendous pressure, working first thing in the morning, last thing at night. I was a young detective constable working at Drumchapel at that time. Nothing to do with the Bible John inquiry. But they decided to get all the detectives in and see, did anyone have any suggestions?
Jeannie had told police that the suspect had mentioned details about his life, maybe his job or where he lived, and she just couldn't remember what it was, and it was really important to find out.
And I thought, that's an ideal person to be hypnotised so that we could find out what did he say and what he didn't say. So I raised my hand and said, what about hypnotism? And immediately everybody burst out laughing and said, who are you, you idiot? So I was ordered to away back and hide in Drumchapel out the road. But a few days later, I got a phone call from Chief Superintendent Beattie to say he wanted to see me. And when I went down to see him, he said, that was quite a good idea you had.
So the police asked a hypnotist to put her under hypnosis to see if the subconscious would come out and she could recall.
We got more information about what the suspect had said. She remembered he asked the women, well, they married, and they both said yes. He said, oh, you know what happens to the adulterous wife? Did you read it in the Bible? No, I never saw that. She gets stoned to death.
He's quite well spoken, with a Glasgow accent.
He was said to be between 25 and 30, light auburn reddish hair, brushed to the right.
He may have marks on his face or hands of recent origin.
The suspect was 5'10" and he had overlapping teeth. He smoked embassy cigarettes. Everything was known about this guy.
He may speak of having had a strict religious upbringing and make reference to the Bible.
The press will look at things from their own perspective. They'll say, right, I need something to hang this on. And you need a name.
It is thought that his Christian name may be John.
Newspapers dubbed him Bible John.
And that's really what sort of linked all three things together in the minds of the public. Bible John, it was the same man, he was the same killer.
Police hunting the dancehall killer have been flooded with calls from people who think they know the mysterious Bible John.
With him quoting all this Bible carry on, I think he was a bit of a fanatic. He had something against women, you know, because they hadn't the right to go and enjoy themselves. You know, they should be staying in the house with their family.
They obviously thought it was quite chilling. A Bible-quoting monster picking up women from dance halls and killing them.
Is it really the case that the man that you are searching for as the killer could strike again?
There's a possibility he may, yes.
The search goes on. Somewhere there may be two plainclothes men waiting for a door to open. Somewhere a telephone may be ringing in a police office.
Marine murder room, BT.
For Joe, Jeannie Williams was an absolutely critical witness, particularly her physical description of Bible John.
Every word that the victim's sister said was gospel to him.
What the police do is decide, using Jean's testimony in particular, to produce a portrait.
Into the scene, Mr. Lennox Patterson, Registrar of Glasgow School of Art.
I did manage to get an impression of a type of person, rather like a handsome ladies' man. And I did try to prevent an expression. It may be that he can change his expression and his tune to suit company.
The face of Bible John. Murder Squad detectives last night issued this artist's impression of a man they wish to interview in connection with the killing of Mrs. Helen Puttock.
When the poster came out, it was such a striking poster. People, it caught their eye. It was used and used and used. And it was taken around newsagents, it was taken to dentists, it was taken to doctors.
He looked as if he was on leave from the army. Short back and sides, clean complexion, blue eyes. And that's what they looked like, you know, just a perfectly straight up, handsome chap.
It was in the papers and on the television, and you were a bit, you know, frightened out.
It seemed so good, the artist's impression, that it was just a question of time before somebody said, I know him.
It's a very able artist at work, and Jeannie, the victim's sister, when she saw the drawing, she said, give that man a medal. It was so closely resembling what she could recall. I've been doing it now for about 35 years, I think, something like that. And it is always fascinating how much people can recall. The poor bewildered witness arrives with a fuzzy picture in their head, maybe, of what their attacker looked like. As it is, it's from their head into my head, down my arm and onto the paper. It is important that any detail that the witness recalls, it should be included.
One of the aspects of the poster that's seldom mentioned is that Bible John was said to have had crooked teeth that were very obvious and very significant. You don't see that in the poster.
So, at the moment, what I'm trying to do is make a copy of his drawing, but open the mouth to depict these teeth.
You live very close to it. In fact, they say that you carry a plastic replica of the teeth of the man you're anxious to talk to.
No, this is quite untrue. We do have a plastic replica of the teeth. Here's the plastic replica of the teeth, but they're not carried by me or any of the other officers.
I think with witnesses, one of the things you need to do is to find out every possible detail in as gentle a fashion as you can, because after all, you're taking them back to the scene of something horrific. We couldn't think of it in our worst nightmares, the sort of things that I've heard about. It's a process called cognitive interview technique, giving them the chance to perhaps find new memories that they didn't even know they had. Lennox Patterson, he had not had the advantage of working for the police before, as I have. At the time, they were taking a leap in the dark. They didn't know what was going to happen.
The League of Red-Headed Men is bigger than any police force. The special investigation branches of the armed forces and the British Transport Police helped to spread the net. And all through the city streets, the foot slogging goes on.
It was the biggest murder inquiry Scotland has ever seen.
Hundreds of detectives were involved and 50,000 police statements were taken.
Right, gentlemen, the situation is still the same. He's out there and we're in here.
The guys who worked here, they were absolutely dedicated to what they were doing. I mean, Joe Beattie, for instance, he would work his backside off.
He has a definite hairstyle, short.
Police took the step of interviewing all barbers in Glasgow to see if they had any customers with that colour of hair.
His teeth were described, the suit he wore.
Yes,
it's a most unusual suit. They went round tailors in Glasgow with photographs of the suspect asking if he'd bought a suit from them.
Was the killer a serviceman who'd been abroad? Perhaps could have been a seaman.
Police said he was polite, well-spoken, and might make reference to the Bible.
Could have even been a priest. Then there was a story, could have been a monk.
They were suddenly raiding every church and every Sunday service in the land, looking for some, gibbering religious fanatic.
Let us pray.
He may well have quoted the Bible, but it seems to me he could have been quoting the Bible as a joke or in passing.
If you were brought up at that time, you'd be able to spout bits and pieces of the Bible, Old and New Testament, because everybody did religious instruction.
It may even have contributed to a lot of misnomers around that killer. It might have thrown the scent a little bit. Now, of course, that grows out of the west coast of Scotland's particular anxieties at that time. This is a place of sectarianism. This is a place of Catholics and Protestants, of a great deal of anxiety about where you belong on the religious spectrum. That's the Glasgow of the period. But the papers needed an identity for this killer, and so they jumped on it.
He became a bit of a bogeyman, I suppose, in Glasgow, because, mothers would tell their kids if they were bad, you just be careful, otherwise Bible John will get you.
Waynes all around Scotland were frightened of Bible John, and they didn't even understand what Bible John was. He was the Freddy Krueger of his day.
Murder is the most compelling crime of all. Most of us are students of this grisly subject.
At this point in our social history, the notion of the sadistic sexual murderer just didn't exist. And I think a lot of people would have found it really quite frightening because they were being faced with a really very unusual type of individual that they possibly didn't even know existed at this point.
What's the murderer like? What is he really like?
Well, I can't think, reading about some of the terrible murders that are committed, that they're human. I don't think they can be human.
Yeah. I mean, this is a classic misunderstanding of what a murderer is actually like. This notion of this superhuman monster just doesn't ring true. Typically, they're inadequate individuals. Typically, they're people who are living out some kind of I'm the victim narrative or perhaps some great heroic story.
To the criminologist, the victim is part of the equation. Terence Morris of the London School of Economics.
You see, it's very difficult for people in our society to see the victim as anything except a total innocent. This is simply not the case.
I mean, obviously, that kind of attitude is not something that is accepted these days.
One has got to recognise that certain victims behave, for a variety of reasons, in a way which precipitates their own death.
I think in that time, it was possible to judge women, especially working class women, for having been out. What are women doing out on a Thursday night when they've got kids? People would say. Almost as if they were somehow part of the darkness that enveloped them. This is a horrific thing.
The idea that by somebody putting themselves in a vulnerable situation or finding themselves in a vulnerable situation, they somehow precipitated a murder is ridiculous, is inaccurate. These days, what we know is that predatory offenders like Bible John would have picked up on that vulnerability, and that's how their vulnerability played into the equation, not that it was in some way their fault what happened.
I understand the murder inquiry is now 5 months old this weekend. Has anything special been happening this weekend, being a holiday weekend?
Well, I would say this is the first day that the men have had off since the murder inquiry started.
Does the fact arise that you still have a lot to do? I mean, are you in fact now at the dry and desperate stage?
No, we're anything but dry and desperate. In fact, I would say that we have at least half a dozen good tricks up our sleeve that we can and will use if we don't get the phone call or information we're seeking. But we're far, far from being dry and desperate.
Certainly what we did on that inquiry, we did as much as we could, but probably in the wrong direction. And on lots of occasions, I felt that.
The police tried something new, something entirely new in Scotland, PhotoFit. It is an assembly of 5 different facial parts pieced together from the evidence of witnesses. PhotoFit, a system devised by a man living in England going under the name of Jacques Penry, who was not even a policeman.
Jacques Penry was a very good salesman. When he was on his uppers at an earlier time, he sold Bibles from door to door and made a great success of it.
It is my business to detect and analyze facial characteristics.
He liked to describe himself as a face expert, but he had no academic or scientific background at all. And he really made his living out of his wits.
I would like you to observe for yourselves the vast difference between 2 young girls of opposite type. Number 1 is aggressive, determined, practical, and much of the motor type. Number 2 is
Penry had a belief that you could infer people's character from their physical appearance. It's like a long, angular nose was clearly someone who had artistic temperament.
These 2 distinct profiles represent opposite natures. Now here are the 2 young ladies in question. Ruth is number 1 and Joan number 2.
He comes across in a very smooth and convincing way.
Suppose that you were in the presence of somebody you disliked and they said something disagreeable about you in the presence of others. What would you do?
I'd be furious.
And how would you behave in similar circumstances, Joan?
I think I should blush.
But it was through that he got the idea of constructing a face from the component parts and the way in which you could change the appearance of a face by taking out one set of eyes and putting in a different set of eyes.
Crooks, beware. The Home Office now has a new system of criminal identification, PhotoFit, said to be even more accurate than the line-drawn identikit process currently used by the police. The inventor, Mr. Penry of Tunbridge Wells, introduces the new technique.
Well, PhotoFit was launched at a grand reception at the Savoy Hotel in London. And it was taken up enthusiastically by all but one of the British regional police forces.
The real face of Bible John. police hunting Bible John, the man wanted in connection with 3 murders, issued this remarkable picture yesterday.
People saw, quote, Bible John, and quote, everywhere.
He was Bible John, it said. And women would be looking everywhere, at brothers, at uncles, at old boyfriends, thinking, could that be Bible John? My mother, I mean, she grew up in the Gallowgate and she went to the Barrowland, and she describes to this day the eyes of that man and what he meant and how we feared him.
And I appeal to everyone, if you think you know this man, contact your nearest police station immediately.
Bible John here, his hair as it was seen that night, if he changed his style slightly in keeping with modern trend, would be to grow his hair a bit longer, maybe on the Georgie Best idea.
The police very rarely issue to the public sketches or composites because they inevitably create enormous amounts of publicity. Most of these are for internal use, thumbed up on bulletin boards. But of course, in the Bible John murders, there was an appetite for any information.
Up and down the city streets, in and out of the Eagle, the Nag's Head, the buses, the blue trains, the ballrooms, always showing the picture.
Oh, yes.
I think that the photo fit was almost too good because it produced hundreds, literally hundreds, of wrong leads and took up an awful lot of police time.
As notifications continue to come in by telephone from other parts of the country, detectives on the murder squad have already covered about 50,000 miles in Glasgow and the surrounding area. And of course, the docks, to check out the crews of the ships that were berthed there at the time of the murder. The scope of the inquiry is enormous.
People were imagining this killer. It's hard to over-describe, really, the native fear that that can engender, especially in a particular area where the murders have been happening. And the city went into a kind of fearful lockdown.
The quest impinges on the life of ordinary people nearly everywhere. A man on a taxi journey to Edinburgh innocently quotes the Bible to the driver and finds himself deposited at police headquarters as a suspect. Another man, tired of being teased for looking like Bible John, assaults his wife.
That's how deep the fear and the paranoia went.
Day in, day out, something new. Faces in the busy streets being studied closely.
Envy, who looked a wee bit like that picture, was getting fired in, you know, and we were going and interviewing him, seeing him, talking to him, bringing him in.
It does, in many ways, I think, provide a very problematic distraction for the police.
Lots of times, you know, people would phone up and say it was their next door neighbour and stuff like that, you know, just to wind them up, you know.
In talking to approximately 40,000 people so far, the police have been given the names of men who resemble the description of Bible John. And some of these men have been picked up more than once.
Beatty came in and he's, you know, complimenting, you know, you're a rare likeness, you know, calls everybody son sort of style, you know.
That didn't cheer you up though?
No, not at the time it didn't. I mean, I can talk about it now, but at the time I was getting worked up.
There were so many of them that the police started to issue cards that said, "I am not Bible John." If you were cleared, you got one of these cards.
There was even one policeman who was a dead ringer for Bible John, who was called in. He eventually became an assistant chief constable, and he did look like Bible John, but it wasn't him.
I think that one of the biggest problems with the Bible John theory is the reliance on that image.
But having said that, the police, they need to keep that story going so that the public remember. So to bring it back, we used to arrange identification parades, and the story would be out again.
Whenever anybody was hauled in as a possible suspect, the first thing Joe Beattie would do is look at their teeth. And almost immediately, if the teeth weren't right, he'd say, well, that's very unlikely.
Now, I've no doubt the Moses witness tried her best every way to help us with this, because it was her sister who was murdered. And it isn't good just to base it on the one person.
People see things that they are in some ways conditioned to see. Any legal or crime historian knows that witness testimony, with the best will in the world, is not necessarily particularly accurate.
Into the scene in the spring of this year came a mysterious figure, an elderly Dutchman who calls himself a paragnost, a man of psychic powers who has used them to help police in Europe and America with murder cases.
Gerard Croiset, he had helped police to solve a number of really unusual cases by clutching a bit of clothing from the victim or whatever. And I got a book on him from the library, read up on him, and I thought, you know, I wonder if we could get him over to do Bible John.
60-year-old Gerard Croiset is a puzzling man. From his home in Utrecht, he looks at photographs and offers clues he says will solve the mystery or the crime. Nobody knows whether he really is clairvoyant or whether it's just a lot of luck. But he's built up quite a reputation.
Croiset gives lead in hunt for Bible John. World-famous Dutch clairvoyant Gerard Croiset last night looked into the past and compiled a detailed dossier to help Glasgow detectives track down Bible John.
What were his psychic prognostications worth?
Well, he confirmed certain things that the police had in mind. For instance, on a map of Glasgow, a large-scale map of Glasgow, he delineated an area where he claimed that the suspect lived. And this area has, for a long time, been thought by police to be the area where the man does live.
He started sketching things, and he sketched an old engine and old cars, a road, and a hill with greenery on it. I recognised roughly where it was. It was Bellahouston Park in the main Paisley Road West. And we actually found an old engine and rusty cars.
He described the man as having a military bearing with his chest puffed out and shoulders back. The police had never revealed publicly that, you know, that the suspect had carried himself in this manner.
Well, I didn't disregard or dismiss Croiset. There's a book being written about Croiset, and Croiset's public service has been excellent in this book.
Joe Beattie was quite excited about it, and he got his detectives to do door-to-door inquiries all around the areas where we thought this might be.
Well, when you checked over this area that this man represented, did you in fact find any possible suspects in there?
We have had several suspects from this area, and of course we have screened them possibly closer than we would normally. Of course, they've come up negative, but we're still hoping.
Actually, the police have often been quite drawn to psychics, although it's all pretty bogus.
I mean, obviously, I did it to help boost the circulation of the newspaper and to get me big stories, but as a crime reporter, I felt in a way it was my moral duty, you know, to get as much publicity. And the more publicity it was given, the more people came forward.
Joe Beattie, not surprisingly, was obsessed by this case. He went to great lengths to try and build up a picture of Bible John.
Since February 1968, police have hunted the man known as Bible John. But today, there is a new urgency. An urgency sparked by a psychiatrist called in to give them an insight into Bible John's personality. His report made grim reading.
From recollection, it was actually Joe Beattie that handed me Dr. Britton's treatise on sadistic sexual murderers and asked me if I'd like to do a story on it, which I did. I was only happy to do it because it kept the inquiry alive for the police at a time when it was, you know, beginning to flounder a bit.
Dr. Robert Britton was an experienced forensic psychiatrist. In other words, he was a doctor who specialised in working with what used to be called the criminally insane.
Dr. Britton had impressive credentials. He had worked at Broadmoor, then on to Carstairs, both special hospitals, where he would have been exposed to a number of these types of individuals. Joe Beattie realised that there was something he didn't understand about the type of individuals that he was investigating. So he went to Dr. Britton for insight.
The sadistic murderer is almost always male. The seeds of his abnormalities would seem to be planted at a very early age, and a careful history will often show clear evidence of some manifestations of his perversions even before puberty. He can be prim, proper, even prudish, avoiding profanities himself and condemning obscenity, vulgarity, or impropriety in others. He condemns sexual conversations and deplores blue stories.
That approach to Dr. Britton, a psychiatrist, would have been really quite forward-thinking at that stage in our social history.
The method of killing is almost always asphyxia, and a gag may occasionally be employed.
And it looks very much as if she may have been strangled, doesn't it?
Such men will sometimes explain that shooting is too sudden a way of killing the victim. For their pleasure will be ended too quickly.
And little tiny hemorrhages in the eyes, as one sees with strangling.
The sight of suffering can excite him further, and his brutality can be increased by the helplessness and fear of his victim.
The detail and the insights and the understanding that Dr. Britton shows before even the FBI was beginning its profiling activities in America, that was really quite remarkable.
Detective Superintendent Joe Beattie said yesterday,
"We are treating the doctor's report very seriously. We have never wanted to put the public into a panic, but we cannot exclude the possibility that this man may strike again. The psychiatrist's report underlines this."
When you create a picture of somebody who is really bizarre, who gets sexual excitement out of hurting others, then that raises the intrigue and the anxiety, of course. And if you can say a serial killer is just like anybody else wandering around the streets, that makes people very anxious.
Is he an unusual character living behind a commonplace, conventional facade, or what is he?
I would say that this man is possibly a loner. He lives, I would think, with a relative. He's a personable man, good-looking. He possibly occupies some place in society where he has a little authority.
These people read, study, and collect books which relate in some way to their perversion. Some are fiction, some are not. It is sufficient, however, to say that they commonly relate to some of the following.
Such a man, such a superficially clean-cut, upstanding figure, must have some kind of social contacts.
Yes, he does have social contacts. They are aware of him, but unfortunately, they are eliminating him in their mind because of this clean-cutness that you speak of.
The idea that there could be some gentle, withdrawn, almost shy individual who beneath that facade could be capable of this kind of sadistic sexual activity would have been something I think the general public would have found really quite alarming.
Making available these sorts of reports from experts about the nature of the individual who the police are looking for is potentially very dangerous and inappropriate. If the expert has got it wrong, that can be very misleading, and there are plenty of cases where the profile has been made publicly available and that has meant the actual offender has gone unnoticed, unexplored, because the police or in fact other individuals have thought, oh no, it can't be him because it doesn't fit the profile.
What Dr. Britton doesn't give us are facts and figures, our probabilities, our percentages, or any empirical data about the type of individual he's describing. Nonetheless, it's an account that would be useful in terms of extending investigators' understanding of the type of individual that they may be looking for, particularly at that point in our history.
I mean, it was a great story to do, and it showed how the police were trying absolutely everything to get to the bottom of the story and identify the killer.
What does your own particular sixth sense as an experienced detective officer tell you? Is he still about, or is he gone?
I would feel he's still about.
Joe Beattie was determined to get to the bottom of it, but unfortunately that wasn't to be the case.
Joe had explored every avenue he could and tried everything he could, and it just got to a situation there was nothing left to do.
Joe Beattie, to the end of his days, still regretted that that was the case. He calls it the one that got away. Well, I was drawn to the Bible John murders back in 1996. There'd been renewed interest in the case. They reckoned they might have a suspect, and they'd begun digging up the corpse.
Police in Strathclyde say they're close to confirming the identity of a serial killer known as Bible John, who committed a series of murders a quarter of a century ago.
By the time dawn broke over Stonehouse Cemetery, police had already prepared the way for the exhumation of John McInnes from the grave where he's been buried since his suicide 16 years ago.
He was an ex-army type. He'd been at the Barrowland, and they were going to dig up his body and do some DNA tests on it.
DNA testing, genetic fingerprinting, which matched samples from Helen Puttock's clothing with swabs from a member of the suspected killer's family.
Jeannie Williams never thought that John McInnes was the right man. She'd seen him in identity parades. She didn't get that jolt of recognition that she would have expected. And Joe Beattie agreed. He didn't think McInnes was the right man either.
Strathclyde Police received a report last week from experts showing there is no match between John McInnes's genetic fingerprint and semen stains found on the tights of one of his victims, Helen Puttock, who was strangled in 1969.
Victims deserve answers. I was a detective superintendent with Strathclyde Police. I was in the police for 34 years. In 2007, I was the detective superintendent running an operation called Operation Anagram regarding the serial killer Peter Tobin.
They have searched for 9 days here, using pickaxes, radar and even their bare hands at times, all in a vain search for bodies. Police suspect Tobin, who's from Renfrewshire, of killing many young women, and they still do.
We researched any potential links between Peter Tobin and the so-called Bible John. Peter Tobin, with the first two murders, was in Brighton. He got married. The artist's impression that was compiled, it shows that the suspect had red hair. We have photographs of Peter Tobin in the 60s, and Tobin, his hair is not like that. There was DNA found on Helen Puttock's tights. One thing for sure, that DNA is not Peter Tobin's, because Peter Tobin's profile has been compared against it. There is nothing to indicate that Peter Tobin was involved in these cases.
When you look back at the time of Bible John, you realise the fascinating complexity of it all and how it has lasted through the years. And in particular to me as a writer, I'm interested how it has spawned so many theories.
In the Gamble Gate where the Bowers was, you crossed the road and there was this big bit of land. And they had a lot of things with skips up there for people dumping rubbish. And it seems that one time they found a body and everybody says, that's one of Bible John's bodies. I don't know if there was a lot of maybe poor lasses that he done that were never discovered, you know. That's the way it was these days.
I was particularly interested in the connection of the Gloucester killer, Frederick West, who had lived in Glasgow during that period.
I've got my own theory as to who it was, and that was the Yorkshire Ripper.
I am not satisfied that the same person was involved in these three cases.
We can't definitively rule out these being quite separate offences, these being particular attacks on particular individuals that came out of particular relationships. But from what we do know, and we don't know very much, but from what we do know, they look to me to be too consistent, to be anything other than the work of the same man.
The question is, of course, why he stops. And we find that offenders do stop for all sorts of reasons. They stop because they're arrested for some other crime and spend time in prison.
It could have been that I'd moved around or was in the army and got shipped over abroad or something like that.
That time it was old style policing. They didn't have DNA, they didn't have CCTV, they didn't have forensic science techniques that they have nowadays. So it is very unfair to go back and be critical of what police officers were trying to do many years ago. I would hope, and I really hope someday someone will be caught, but the chances of that are very slim.
I mean, I'm not getting any younger, and I would just love to find out the truth and find that somebody was punished for the hurt, the heartache that they've caused for me and my family.
It hangs over Glasgow, the Bible John story, mainly because he's never been found. If we had an identity for this guy, if it's one guy, we could then parcel it up and put it away. But an undiscovered killer becomes a permanence, part of the folklore of the city.
Well, we've got to this almost finished stage now. Got the overlapping teeth. And we have to remember this was done as a result of at least 3 we know about girls who didn't ever make it home after dancing with this chap.
These stories live on for a reason. They sink into people's minds and into their social lives, into their understanding of the time that they've lived through. And those basic questions about human nature, how can you kill? How can a society harbour a killer? Does their media encourage or hinder the killer? All these questions are still persistent, and we have to keep going back to them. That's why we have to keep thinking about it.
John if your name is John. John, if you're out there now, watching and listening, maybe it's time to come in out of the glare. The police want